Hi, I'm Eileen. Welcome to ADORNit's online class. Today I'm going to be talking about the Dots and Dashes quilt, which you may have seen featured at Barnes & Noble. My main objective today is that I want to give you some tips and tricks to help make your sewing go a little more smoothly. Sometimes with beginner sewers you can run into some bumps and it makes your sewing experience a little frustrating. So what I'd like to do is give you some tips that might help your sewing experience go a little more flawlessly. One of the things that I like to start out with is I always use a grid or a ruler that is see-through and use a rotary cutter. When you start cutting your fabric, it's always good to cut to the left and to make a cut which will help you start cutting on a really straight edge. Also, if you have cuts that you are making that are larger than the size of the ruler, you can put two rulers together and still continue to get a straight edge, but get a really good cut for your sizing. This quilt has two different types of strips, or two different sizes of strips. One of them is a 7.5 inch strip, and another one is a 4-inch strip. And this quilt has 6 7.5 inch strips and 5 4-inch strips. The larger strips, the 7.5 inch strips, are the ones that will have the circles attached to them. The smaller strips, the 4-inch strips, are the ones that will be pieced together and will give you the colored stripes that go along in the quilt. One of our cuts, we have several that are going to be 4-inch, and some of them are going to be 7.5 inch. But we always like to refer to the width of fabric as WOF. So when you see that in your pattern and don't understand what that means, that just means you are making a cut the full length of this right here. On the ends, you will see these little selvages, and these really don't matter. They're not usable, but you can go ahead and trim one side off and then continue with your sewing. The way this quilt is put together is so that you can, when you get all of your strips sewn, you can lay it down on a large surface or lay it down on a floor, and you can then match up your seams and your strips a little more evenly, and then you can cut off that last bit of this selvage. You don't want to do that right away because each strip is just a little bit different, and this little excess here has been factored into the quilt. So this excess can be cut off. Just don't cut it off until you get to the end. Our first row and every other row after that has a long strip, 7.5 inch strip, that is the width of the fabric, and I have cut off part of the selvage, and it is attached to a 7.5 inch block. The first row will have on one side and then alternating each sides on every other row. This will give you the full length of the width of the strip. These longer strips, and wider strips I mean, are the strips that are going to have your circles on them. And I'll talk about those in just a moment. Your second row is a little bit differently. It is pieced together with the 4-inch strips that are called for in the pattern, and then 4-inch strips of colored fabric. And that is what gives you the stripes on the Dots and Dashes quilt. Inside of this booklet you will find a diagram and you will find a template. This template for the circle is what you're going to be using to cut all of these circles for the quilt. In the instructions it will tell you how many to cut, and on the backs of that fabric you're going to be putting something on called Heat and Bond Light, or another type of adhesive for fabric. And you iron that on after you've traced it, and then it leaves you with this circle with this on the back. It's easily peeled off of the back, and it leaves a shiny coat on the back side. And that is what you will use to iron onto the longer, wider strips. Just to give you an idea, Your strips will be placed depending approximately 2 to 3 inches apart, and then you will follow the diagram for the color and the pattern that it needs to be. There's 2 different things you can do when you are appliquing these circles onto your strips. You can lay all of your strips out before you sew them and then place your circles, and then each strip, after you pin it on or you iron it on, then you can applique around it. You can either do that with a satin stitch on your sewing machine, you can hand stitch it, you can do it with a zigzag stitch. Some machines come with a little fancier stitches, so you can use that, but it doesn't really matter. Another thing you can do is you can sew the entire quilt together and then place your circles, and then you can go ahead and applique. I like to be able to applique on a smaller section of fabric. It's a little easier to maneuver on my sewing machine, but it is really up to you, whatever you prefer. Another tip that I would like to give you is that when you are piecing your strips together, pin your strips. Sometimes people will think that pinning just takes too much time or it really doesn't matter, but for your finished product it really does. It helps keep your seams straight, and it helps keep your quilt more square so that you don't have excess that you have to trim off on the side. The last strip on this quilt is a little bit different than all of the other strips, and that is because it is pieced differently and it doesn't follow the same pattern as the other strips do. This last strip is done by sewing 2 pieces of this cream damask fabric to this navy fabric right here, and this is going to make a horizontal square. On one side you're going to be sewing a 10.5 inch by 7.5 inch rectangular block onto it, and then after you have sewn, or after you have cut all of your pieces, you're going to find some excess on the end of these pieces. And what you're going to do is you're going to piece 2 of these leftover pieces. You should have one approximately that's 28 inches left over and one that's approximately 4 inches left over. Sew these together, and that will give you your 32-inch piece that goes along the back side of this strip, and that will give you your full length of your strip across the bottom of the quilt. As you're quilting, if you iron your rows starting from the top, every other row, if you iron going up and then you iron going down, you can make your quilt come together a little more smoothly. This is called nesting, and that is by taking 2 seams that are together with the seams pressed in opposite directions on the back side and then nesting them together. When you place your dots onto your quilt, another thing that is helpful, I'm just going to demonstrate using 2 different pieces of fabric. When you place your circles, it's nice to get a visual before you iron it down. And not only are you going to want to have your circles in the middle, but you're also going to want to have them centered. And so you can do this by laying your quilt strips out and measuring or eyeing where your circles are and making sure that they are centered with your perpendicular lines and that they are also centered onto the center of the strip. And you can do that by taking masking tape and by putting a little bit of masking tape along your grid here, and then following that along on the middle or the center of your circles so that you can get your circles placed nicely in the center of your strip. This is not a difficult quilt that goes together pretty quickly as far as sewing, but the most challenging for me is making sure that my circles are where I want them to be. That is why it is nice to lay your quilt out when you're done out onto a large surface, and then to put your circles down sew your circles or applique them, and then put the whole quilt together. You can refer back to several of our other tutorials to give you ideas on tips and tricks on how you can make your sewing experience a little more smooth, and that you can learn some other techniques that might help you to make this quilt and your other sewing projects go well. Thank you for watching. I'm Eileen with ADORNit, and welcome and thank you for watching our ADORNit online class.